Welcome to South Cross Bayou Advanced Water Reclamation Facility, and we're glad you're joining us today for a virtual tour, as we'll be learning a lot more than just the wastewater treatment processes. We'll also be learning about how we recover resources like reclaimed water from sewage and fertilizer from solids. Are you ready? Let's do this. So right now we are outside the influent pump station. An influent is what we call all the raw wastewater before it's treated when it enters our facility. So behind me there are grinders and 3 pumps on each side of this building that help to push all of the raw wastewater into our facility where it can further be treated. So after all the wastewater or the influent has entered the facility, it then travels here to what is called the headworks. And the goal of the headworks is to remove all of the trash from the wastewater stream. We do that using what are called bar screens. They're like large pieces of white plastic that have holes in them. And the idea is that the holes keep the water flowing while they capture the trash. So inside the headworks behind me at the top, all that trash is caught inside the bar screens. It then goes through a compactor and then down the chute into the dumpster, where it will then go to solid waste to get incinerated. So once the wastewater passes through the headworks where we remove the trash, the next step is to remove the grit. So all of the small things like sand, rocks, pebbles, or seeds that might have passed through those teeny holes on the bar screens will now end up in one of these 14 teacups. So inside one of these 14 teacups behind me, what we do is we spin the water around really quickly. So everything that's heavier than water, like the rocks and the sand and the seeds, will then fall to the bottom. And the next stage, we will remove them in the grit snails. From the teacups, the grit will then travel to one of these 2 grit snails, where you can see behind me the grit is exiting into one of these 2 blue bins, where it will then be sent to solid waste to be incinerated. Grit includes things like sands, seeds, and small pebbles and rocks. From the teacups, the wastewater is then sent to one of the primary clarifiers, as you can see behind me. And the goal of the primary clarifiers is to help settle out some of the solids in the wastewater. So heavier particles will sink to the bottom and lighter ones can be skimmed off the top. From here, the water will then go into biological treatment through the anoxic tanks. These next set of tanks, which are called anoxic and aeration, are designed to help us remove nitrogen compounds from the wastewater. We call this biological treatment. From the primary clarifiers, the wastewater then travels to what we call the anoxic tanks, as you can see behind me. These tanks contain a lot of bacteria and microbiology inside of them. The goal of these tanks is that we want to remove nutrients from the wastewater, like nitrates. And while nitrates are good because they're a source of food for plants, if we release them in the environment in too high of quantities, we can actually pollute our waterways. So microbes actually attack these nitrates because they need the oxygen that is attached to the nitrogen molecule. So by removing the oxygens, they can then release nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. From the anoxic tanks, the wastewater then enters what we call the aeration tanks, which you can see behind me. Because the bacteria in the anoxic tanks used all of the oxygen, we then add air back into the system. So the bacteria inside these aeration tanks are no longer targeting nitrate compounds, they're actually targeting ammonia-based compounds like this one. Ammonia is commonly found in human urine, and it contains a nitrogen surrounded by 3 hydrogens. So what the bacteria in these aeration tanks behind me are doing is they're actually converting these ammonia-based compounds back into the nitrate compounds, which we can then send back into our anoxic tanks for further treatment. The significance of this is that we use a looping system. So after the wastewater leaves the aeration tanks, we then add some chemicals to it. The first chemical we add is called Nalmet, and Nalmet helps us remove copper from the wastewater stream. We then add a chemical called alum, or aluminum sulfate. The goal of the aluminum sulfate is that the aluminum will actually bind to the phosphates in our solids, and it'll help it make it dense, so that when we then put that water into our secondary clarifier, as you can see behind me, all of our solids will sink to the bottom. If you look closely at this tank, you will notice that there's a metal arm that is slowly skimming the surface. So anything that's less dense than water, we can skim off the top, and anything that becomes denser, that falls to the bottom, we actually can scrape off the bottom. So this next stage of the wastewater treatment process actually involves what we call the denitrification filters. And what these filters do is they allow us to remove additional nitrogen compounds in the wastewater. So when all the wastewater comes over to here from one of those secondary clarifiers, We put it inside one of these filters that are filled with sand and gravel. They have a lot of different anaerobic bacteria in there, meaning bacteria that don't like oxygen. We supply them with methanol as a food source so that they can help to break down those extra nitrogen compounds like nitrates that still persist in the water. From here, the water will then go to disinfection, where it will be finally treated and then released. So now that we've removed all of the trash, the nutrients, and the solids from the wastewater stream, the last thing for us to do is to disinfect the water. So as you can see behind me, this is what we call the chlorine contact chamber. So we use two different technologies to disinfect the water at this treatment plant. This one is chlorine. So we put the water inside this tank that we call the chlorine contact chamber, where it is in contact with the chlorine gas for 15 minutes. That's important because it takes 15 minutes for this chlorine to kill all the pathogens, which are the disease-causing microbes like bacteria, viruses, protozoan cysts, and fungi that would otherwise make us sick. So as you can see behind me, these are individual UV bulbs. The idea here is that when we push the water through these bulbs, the water will flow freely, sometimes in a serpentine pattern around these UV bulbs that are emitting a UV ultraviolet radiation. That light attacks the inside of bacteria, viruses, basically destroying their DNA or their RNA so that they can no longer replicate. Again, this is a technology that we use to disinfect the water that is highly effective. So after the water has been disinfected, either using chlorine or ultraviolet light, the last thing that we need to do is we either need to send it back out into the community to be used as reclaim, or else we can release it into the environment. So the structure behind me is called the outfall cascade. If we make too much reclaimed water, depending if it went through chlorine, we then have to dechlorinate it using sulfur dioxide, or if we used UV light, it's done. We can release that water through the structure behind me. So when the water goes through that structure behind me that looks kind of like a giant slide, it's actually being tumbled as it works its way down. And what that's doing is it's adding oxygen back into the water. Oxygen's important because dissolved oxygen is what aquatic life breathes. So by adding oxygen back into the water before we release it into the environment, we're actually improving the quality of the water, and we're making it better for the marine life that are then going to breathe it. So once we've separated all of the solids out from either the primary or the secondary clarifiers, we then send them here to one of our two egg-shaped digesters. So when you think about a digester, think about your stomach. This is an environment that's really harsh. It's full of bacteria that are anaerobic. In other words, these bacteria do not like oxygen. These bacteria are also very hungry, which means they need a food source. So as these bacteria are eating away at all of the solids in the wastewater, or what we call sludge, this goes on for about 2 weeks. The bacteria eat, they die. The next generation of bacteria comes along and eats them, and then they die, and so forth. So after 2 weeks, we actually remove this sludge from the building in the middle that we've called the holding cylinder, and that is ultimately what we turn into our fertilizer. Well, with that, we've reached our final stop on our virtual tour. And behind me are the purple pipes where you see the reclaimed water that we've made here at our facility actually exiting the facility and going out into the community. Now remember, reclaimed water, purple pipes, are just for irrigation and decorative fountains. It's not drinking water. So next time you see these purple pipes, just remember how much science, how much technology, engineering, mathematics, and all the people who work here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year to make sure all that sewage water or wastewater was treated to be made into safe reclaimed water for irrigation.